Good morning and welcome to my session on creating sustainable change in diversity, equity and inclusion. I'm going to be focusing heavily on the corporate world and managing diversity, equity, inclusion within a corporate or a business structure. It's one of those areas where the drive is somewhat slowing down now. The social pressure has moved on from the original impetus, which in 2020 was the murder of George Floyd, and it's becoming politically somewhat of a dangerous topic for a lot of organizations. And so my intent with this framework was to provide a methodology for organizations to leverage existing impetus to generate sustainable long-term change in their organization, even when the social pressure has moved on to a different focus. And there's a lot that has been written and researched on the importance of DEI in the workplace. And there are many strategies that have been suggested for how to go about implementing a meaningful DEI program in the workplace. But one of the primary issues surrounding those strategies is that they tend to assume a consistent level of impetus and momentum at all levels of the organization, outside of an activism context that just simply isn't true for most businesses. Oftentimes we see a conflict between the drive and purpose of an ERG or an employee resource group and the drive of senior leadership or the C-suite in implementing meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so what I wanted to do with this model is provide a very basic structure that's rooted in some of the fundamental aspects of science and how groups work in general, in order to allow meaningful change and generate generous conversations across time without being reliant on external factors like social pressure and political climate. So to start with, let's briefly touch on who I am and where I am coming from. So my name is MRowan. My pronouns are she, her. I am a short white woman with lavender hair, wearing a grey t-shirt and jeans, standing in front of a projector screen. I am the chair of the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Council at Delta Dental of Arkansas in the United States, and I have held that post since late 2020. And I am also the Community Impact Analyst for the Delta Dental of Arkansas Foundation, where my role is to evaluate and approve grant applications for the various grant funds that we have, and then monitor the implementation and impact of those grant funds on our underserved and uninsured communities here in the state of Arkansas. My background is in physics and biology. I've been an educator for almost 15 years, and I really started getting interested in the DEI space about 5 years ago, when I first started to become active in the corporate world here in the US. The foundation itself, where I currently work, is the non-profit arm of Delta Dental of Arkansas, which is a dental and vision insurance company based in Arkansas in the United States. Our insurance license allows us to sell insurance to companies that are headquartered in Arkansas, but the quirk of that particular requirement is that the business itself can operate all over the states and in fact even internationally. So we are fortunate enough to have the contract for some really major businesses that happen to be headquartered here in the state of Arkansas but operate nationally, which really expands our ability to impact communities across the United States. The Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Council, of which I am the current chair, was created in 2020, as were a lot of corporate diversity, equity and inclusion programs, in response to the Black Lives Matter protests and the murder of George Floyd. And we have found that our organization is pretty much a textbook example for this kind of business-driven diversity initiative. Our biggest successes has come from the times when we have taken the business out of the equation and focused on what drives people to be successful in this space regardless of their other job roles. And so we had to find a way of presenting that kind of initiative to a leadership team who preferred a rules-driven data approach. Just some background on Arkansas as a state. It has a historically very significant history of racial inequity and racial violence. along with very low tolerance for LGBTQ plus populations and an extremely strong Christian fundamentalist movement within both social and legislative social groups, which makes us challenging for us to implement DEI-based changes on a corporate level, because the business does still need to operate within the legislative space. And so we were forced to take a different approach to a more activism-focused one in identifying and creating our ERG that could be successful in this arena given the challenges that we would face outside it. And so I have found that this model has served us very well in generating meaningful change here in the DEI space. So usually when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the corporate world, we hear these kinds of words being thrown around. People talk about, their reputation, the impact on the business case. Sometimes you hear people talk about affirmative action, and that obviously being a negative side effect of implementing DEI in the workplace. People talk about having representation at all levels of the organization, and that being what they mean when they say diversity. But I would argue that for most businesses, diversity as a stepping stone to achieving that representational parity can be achieved through trust. It can be achieved by acquiring the trust of all of your community stakeholders, even when you aren't in a business place to be able to have physical representation. Physical representation may be what you are driving for, but if you can establish trust and show that your senior leadership team and your business takes into account different perspectives when making business decisions, then you can to some extent allow your business to grow into representational diversity whilst at the same time achieving diversity of groups and diversity of perspectives and diversity of outcomes on that journey, whilst you're on that journey. So for us, for example, Arkansas has one of the largest population of Marshallese outside of the Marshall Islands. In fact, the largest community of Marshall Islanders outside of the Marshall Islands in the United States. But they are very geographically clustered in an area we do not have a physical office location. So our business does not have any Marshallese employees, but we do have the trust of the Marshallese community that we will take into account the needs and perspectives of that group when we make business decisions that could impact them. And so that has enabled us to achieve inclusiveness in our business practices, even outside of the normal business approach of representation and hiring and kind of placing the onus on that HR group instead. An effective DEI program, therefore, needs to be one that identifies and empowers individuals from diverse backgrounds to actively contribute to company strategic initiatives, even if that would normally fall outside of the scope of their job. So we really sought to answer the question, how can you enable your DEI group in your organization to be successful, even when social change moves away, the social focus moves away, or political focus or political pressure comes to bear? We wanted to change the way we approach it to see it as not a business issue alone, which is often the case. Too often we lean too heavily into the business case and end up staffing an initiative with mission-oriented people who do not have DEI experience. And we also wanted to avoid making it just a social issue, which creates DEI groups staffed by more activist personnel who maybe don't have the capacity to actually implement the changes that they want. We especially wanted to change the way that diversity, equity, and inclusion is talked about in tech or in science spaces. And the challenge was also in reconciling the difference between activism and corporate identity. So really who we were trying to close the loop was between individuals at a company who have a personal passion or drive for diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and leaders who don't necessarily feel set up for success or feel it is a requirement of the program in order to generate more revenue. We were explicitly targeting individuals who don't want to engage with the social and emotional aspects or who are not persuaded by the social and emotional aspects of the work. And so we've chosen to reframe the language into a logical, fundamental, and repetitive scientific framework to help showcase some of the core foci and core components of a meaningful objective. So we thought, what if we took a look at chemistry and some of the fundamentals of chemical reactions, because that actually translates really nicely to social spaces and social groups. And so that's what we did. So I'm going to start off with a brief primer, however you want to say it, of chemistry and chemical reactions. So this is a very broad overview. Apologies if it is something that is familiar to anybody. But fundamentally, chemical reactions involve two or more existing chemicals, either as elements or as existing compounds, interacting with each other in a manner that results in the creation of a new molecule or molecules from that interaction, which is referred to as a reaction. And that reaction can take several forms, but most chemical reactions involve the breaking of existing bonds between the reactants and the formation of new bonds into the products. And that takes energy. It takes energy to break the bonds between the existing reactants, and it takes energy to form new bonds in the form of the products. Depending on the nature of the reactants, it could firstly require expending energy, so an exothermic reaction, generating heat in order to break those reactions and break those bonds, or it could involve the taking in of energy in an endothermic reaction to form new bonds. And often the success of a reaction is dependent on how much energy the reactant started with versus how much energy they needed to create or break the bonds and form a new compound. So we refer to this as the activation energy, the energy that is intrinsically required by a chemical reaction in order to drive the breaking of existing bonds and the formation of new ones. And that activation energy is fixed. It is defined by what you are trying to create. And sometimes you find that the reactants, the chemicals that you started with, do not have enough energy in and of themselves to create a successful, sustainable chemical reaction. They do not have enough intrinsic energy to overcome the energy required for the reaction to be successful. And in this case, we can say that if the energy of the reactants is less than the activation energy, the energy required for a reaction to move forward, we don't see a reaction. And it does not matter the conditions that you place those reactants in. If they do not have the energy within to create that activation energy or overcome the activation energy barrier, no new activity will take place. And you can actually say exactly the same thing about people in a social group. You can put them in the best possible conditions for success. If their intrinsic energy, their intrinsic motivation is not enough to overcome the barriers to their success, nothing will happen. And in DEI, this is often what we see. So how can we use this model to create a meaningful DEI initiative? What can we learn from chemistry that can help us drive towards that? We need to ask ourselves two questions. First of all, how do you know what your activation energy is? How do you know what your threshold for successful activity would be? And second of all, how are you going to reach it? So to identify the threshold for action or activation energy, you could look at similar organizations for models, or consider other employee-driven groups within your own business and seeing what has been successful there. However, often it comes down to identifying and measuring the limiting factors. What's going to prevent your group from being successful? What's going to reduce their motivation or prevent them from being able to translate that motivation into a successful outcome? This means that the motivational barrier for success will be predicated on what would prevent success from being meaningful. So we could also look at culture, environment, access to resourcing, budgeting. opportunities for access to leadership buy-in, the flattening of a hierarchy. All of these components are going to affect your activation energy. We could also look backwards at what have prevented meaningful change in other organizational groups. Defining the threshold for action or your activation energy is going to be crucial to establishing the success of your group, because once you know what your barriers are, you can work to change them. Which brings us into the second piece. How can you ensure that your group reaches that activation energy? If their intrinsic motivation is not enough to overcome the barriers to success, how can you reduce those barriers or increase their motivation to make them more successful? You can't, generally speaking, by themselves make them more motivated than they already are. So we can turn to the idea of a catalyst. In chemistry, a catalyst can be used to lower the activation energy, lower the required amount of energy for a reaction to be successful without being used itself, which can often mean that reactants that would not normally be able to generate a successful product can now reach the lowered threshold. Well, why can't we do that for people? Why can't we take a catalyst, an external force that is not used, not part of the action of the group, and use that to lower the barrier for success? This could be something like establishing a budget for your group, defining clear outcomes, establishing their activity as a strategic priority for the organization. It's not something that the group itself is responsible for necessarily, but it is something that lowers the barriers to success for that group. But unlike in chemistry, in a social group, a catalyst can also be a person. It can also be one individual who really has that motivational capacity, who could again come from outside of the DEI structure. If you think of your organization, there is probably a member of your senior leadership team or management team who is the people motivator, the driver for success, who you can bring into any business-oriented group and have them really get that energy going and cause people to think outside the box in overcoming barriers. DEI groups are no different. If you can introduce a social catalyst, then you can generate enough energy within the group to drive them to overcome their barriers. So as leadership, you are responsible for answering those two questions. What barriers to success are there for my group? What is the activation energy, the threshold required for successful, meaningful, long-term change? And how can I ensure that my group either has the intrinsic energy to overcome those barriers or has the external resourcing necessary to enable them to overcome them? If you do not establish the answers to those two questions before your group even begins, then you will see their intrinsic energy plummet. So I've represented that need as in the form of these equations. If the sum of the total internal motivation, the sum of the reactant energy, is less than that threshold, that activation energy, you will see no successful, meaningful, long-term change. But if, however, you can have the sum of the reactants, the sum of your internal motivations, in the presence of a catalyst, be greater than the energy required for action to be meaningful, then you will see a successful, meaningful, long-term DEI initiative. So what can you take from this? How can you apply this directly to your organization? First of all, we can take step one, identifying the threshold required for your group to be successful, the activation energy. This could be a certain level of autonomy. It could be a certain level of decision making. It could be access to policymakers, executive support, or, and this one is important, it could be a leveling of the hierarchy in these discussions, so that when your employee-focused group is speaking to a vice president about diversity, equity, and inclusion, those hierarchical barriers are not in place. They can speak to each other as equals, and they can have an equal-based conversation where both parties are equally as important. And then once you step outside of the space, the hierarchy snaps back into place. But that level of the hierarchy is often one of the biggest barriers to success. Once you have identified these factors, you want to identify the limiting components, especially within the group. What's their current motivation? What's going to negatively affect that current motivation? How likely is the group right now in its composition to be able to leverage that energy into success? And what are they going to need from you to make that more successful? From there, you can then engage your catalysts. If you've done your best to lower your barriers, the next thing you can do is engage your catalysts, either by removing the limiting factors or increasing the intrinsic energy of the group. That's steps 3 and 4. Lowering the barriers through, for example, resourcing or adequate time management, and increasing the intrinsic energy by engaging with a high motivator. And then step 5, how can you engage on control for external factors like managers or competing priorities that might affect the energy of your team. Now, we looked at this in the context of chemistry, but we have also looked at this through the lens of classical physics, social networking and biology, and then generalized organizational structuring. If you would like to know anything about those particular models, I am happy to talk more about those. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. But thank you for spending your time with me today.